I've gone back to the Art Markers project because it gives us a great opportunity to talk about how we can make our renders more cinematic, more photographic. I've applied all the materials. I'm really happy with the lighting setup, but I'm ready to start looking at some of the render settings and enhancements we can do to make our renders feel more photographic or cinematic. One of the big differences between a computer rendered image and a photograph is that lens. Even though we can simulate a camera lens in the computer, all of the functions and features of a traditional photographic lens are not on by default. Specifically, a camera lens out here in the real world is going to be using an aperture to determine how much light is coming through the opening of the lens. Well, with the computer, we don't have a physical opening that lets light in. It's all simulated. But in the simulated effect of that aperture opening and closing is turned off by default. So let's begin to turn it on and see the instant photographic effects that it's going to have on our environment. So the way we do it is it happens at the camera level. So I got my camera object selected, and I'm going to go down into my camera properties. And what we're looking for is depth of field. Right now, in the default is off, okay? Check it out. When we turn it on, we're now beginning to simulate how a camera lens actually works. A camera lens has an aperture that's going to open and close, much like our eyes have a pupil or an iris that opens and closes to let a certain amount of light in. So when we turn this on, we're now simulating this. It looks pretty cool. Okay, so this is looking pretty great right off the bat. However, everything is kind of blurry, which is not great. Everything is out of focus. So what we're going to do is that we're going to go into the camera or the depth of field options. There's a couple of things we want to look at here. Of course, we need to establish what we're focusing on. The aperture or the f-stop is measured by this value right here. So it is on, it is working. We're just not focusing on the right area, the right plane within inside of our three-dimensional space to get a focus depth that's going to work. So we're going to experiment here. I'm going to hold down the shift key and move my way upwards a little bit. Yeah. And now I can see some areas of my image are becoming a little less blurry, and some areas are becoming more in focused. Yeah, look at this marker down here in the lower left-hand corner of the image. It's not in focus. This one's slightly in focus, and I think my focus is on this red guy right there, which is pretty cool. Let's really make it intense by changing the f-stop. These are real numbers that you'd see on a real camera. If you have a real high-end camera, you'd have a lens that has an f-stop of 1.2. So that's a good place to go. Shoot, if you have a real high-end lens, you could have a value of 1.0. And now check that out. Look at this right here. Look how shallow that depth of field is. This is a marker, and this marker in the lower left, the orange one's out of focus, as is the tip of the blue and the yellow. In the background of the image of the floor, is also out of focus. So just adding some depth of field and then changing that focus distance goes a long way in making our objects feel much more cinematic. We're focusing our audience's attention on kind of this area, probably more on the red one than any other, and it's starting to look pretty great. Okay, that's the first thing that we can do. The second and third thing that we're going to do is in our Eevee render settings. Let's go over into our render settings and look at some of the options in here because there's some good ones that I think you're definitely going to want to take a look at. First and foremost, I almost always turn on ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is going to start to calculate where the natural pooling of shadows are going to happen within inside the mesh. Just turn it on. Sometimes it has a huge impact, especially on fine details. In this particular scene, doesn't look like it's having too much of an impact, but out of habit, it's something I almost always turn on. You can continue to adjust your depth of field quality settings right here, but check this out. Screen space reflections. Right now, the Eevee rendering engine isn't a physically accurate rendering engine. It's kind of faking the relationship between all of these objects inside the render itself. We should be, since these black materials are reflective, we should be seeing its neighbor in the reflections, but we don't, because Eevee is kind of it's not as technologically advanced as a Cycles rendering engine. However, we can fake it with these screen space reflections. Let's go ahead and turn it on. Yeah, check it out. Now we're seeing some reflections here of the neighbors, and it's starting to feel a little bit more cinematic, which is pretty cool. I like that. I like that a lot. Now, another thing that we can do to increase the quality and make our images feel a little bit more cinematic is adjust the qualities of our shadows. Right now, we can do that right here. Right now, we're using point lights to light our scene. Well, this cube size is going to determine the quality of the shadows for point lights and for spotlights. If we increase it, look at it right now, you can just barely see it's kind of chunky. If we increase this cube size to 1024, it gets much more crisp. FYI, this is going to have an influence on our render time. Let's do it real fast. I'm going to render my image. Yeah, look at that. That's starting to look pretty crisp and clear. It's starting to feel a little bit more photographic, which is pretty great. You can experiment with the cube size on your renders. This is something that you'll kind of have to dial in depending on the lights that you use, how far or close your camera is away from the object that's creating the shadows. But this is a good thing to kind of be mindful of, so we can adjust the quality of our shadows in the cube size right there. Now, the last thing that we're going to do is under the color management section. And the color management section is going to determine how the colors are ramping between their values at render. And there's some really great looks in here that we can apply. This is going to adjust the contrast at render. And I think this does a really great job of kind of creating a more cinematic look. Isn't that cool? So that's the medium-high contrast. Here's medium-low. Kind of washes everything out, more kind of gray, if you will. So play around with this. This is entirely by choice. This is artistic. Whoa, the very high contrast is a little too much, right? But I think it was medium high or maybe medium looked pretty fantastic. So let's do medium high. That's with it on. That's with it off. Yeah, I like medium high. This is me. I like this a lot. Let's render this guy. See what we get. Yeah, that's looking pretty stellar. So we can massage the Eevee rendering engine with a few little settings to make our renders beautiful and more cinematic. I definitely encourage you to check out these small little changes that you can make to make your renders and your pictures as pretty as we can make them.